Hey everyone, welcome back to Build Business Better. I'm your host again, Courtney Morningstar, and I'm actually pretty glad you're here because today I want to try something a little different. Instead of interviewing someone, I thought I'd just tell you a story. Now, I've changed the names and a few of the details because client confidentiality is incredibly important to us. But the situation, well, we see versions of this all the time. And honestly, if you own a business, there's a decent chance you'll recognize pieces of yourself in this story. So let's jump in. Let's call this business owner Mark. If you've listened to me before, you know that's probably my go-to name. Mark owned a manufacturing company that he'd built over about 30 years. Good business, great reputation, about 70 employees. Customers actually really loved him. He'd survived recessions, supply chain issues, labor shortages, and anything you can name. From the outside, he looked like the definition of success. Then one day he told himself something I hear from business owners all the time. I think I'm ready to sell. On paper, that seemed totally reasonable. The company was making money. Buyers had actually started calling. His CPA wasn't worried. His attorney had handled acquisitions before, so everything seemed to be lining up. Then the first offer showed up. It completely took Mark off guard. Not because it was insulting, it just wasn't even almost what he had imagined. He'd spent decades building this company, and suddenly he was asking himself, wait, is this really all it's worth? That's when somebody introduced him to us. One of the first things I told him was, now, before we worry about selling your business, let's figure out if your business is actually ready to be sold. Those aren't the same thing. A lot of owners assume that because they're profitable, they're sellable. Sometimes that's true, but a lot of times it isn't. So we started asking him some questions, not accounting questions, business questions. How dependent is the company on you, Mark? Who actually owns the customer relationships? What happens if you're gone for 6 months? As most business owners would know, basically they'd come back to the building on fire and it'd be total chaos, pandemonium, and panic, right? That's not how it's supposed to be. But another question could be, where are the biggest risks? How scalable is the operation? And I remember watching Mark's expression change as we worked through those answers because nobody had ever asked him those questions before. One thing with Mark became obvious almost immediately. Everything revolved around him. The customers called Mark. Employees waited for Mark. Big decisions? Mark. Vendor negotiations? Mark. Pricing? Mark. Now think about that from a buyer's perspective. Are they buying a company or are they buying one guy who happens to own a company? And there's a huge difference. If the owner walks away and everything falls apart, that's not a premium business. That's a risky investment. And you would basically have to chain Mark to the table in order to make sure that that business continued to run. But remember, Mark is exiting. Then we found something else. Almost 40% of his revenue came from one customer. Like one customer. Now, don't get me wrong. Having a great customer is wonderful. Having one customer that can make or break your company, that's terrifying if you're writing the check. Every buyer knows that, which means they're going to discount the value. That's what we would like to call customer concentration. It's not as amazing as you would think that it would be, right? Then we looked at profitability. Revenue looked fantastic, but some product lines barely made money. A couple actually lost money. The company had been so busy growing that nobody had stopped to ask, should we even be doing this work? Like, does this actually make sense for our company, our brand, our bottom line? It's amazing how often growth hides inefficiency. When you're busy, it's easy to mistake activity for progress. And boy, was Mark's team busy. So I asked him a question. I said, Mark, what if we didn't sell this year? He looked totally surprised because he'd already made up his mind. And I said, what if we spent a little time making the business more valuable instead? Now, that's a very different conversation because suddenly we're not trying to get the highest price for today's business. We're trying to create tomorrow's business. So after a lot of pushback from Mark and maybe a little come to reckoning, that's exactly what we did. We started getting the business out of Mark's head. Processes got documented. Leaders started making decisions. We empowered our key men to make those decisions on our behalf. Customers built relationships with more than one person. Slowly, the company stopped depending on one individual. And every step that made the company more valuable, not because we said so, because buyers will say so. And then we tackled customer concentration. Instead of chasing more work from his biggest customer, which would have been the easy thing, we intentionally diversified. It took time, nothing flashy, just disciplined execution. But eventually that concentration risk came down. Again, less risk means higher value. Then we tackled profitability. We cut work that wasn't making money, improved his pricing, fixed operational bottlenecks. The company didn't suddenly double its revenue. It simply became healthier, and healthy businesses are more valuable businesses. One thing I don't think enough business owners talk about, selling isn't just about the purchase price. It's actually what happens to the business owner after the sale. So most of the time we don't consider we're going to get 30 million from selling our business. What are the tax implications of that? How much ends up in your investment portfolio? Can you actually retire the way that you imagined? And for Mark, after decades, he was really hoping that this was going to be the answer to the next 30 years for himself, his wife, and his kids. Can he even turn around and help his kids? Could he set them up for better futures? Could you even support the charities you care about? Because if you spend 30 years building wealth inside your company, you owe it to yourself to have a plan, right? For what happens when that wealth finally becomes liquid. But that's something that a lot of people have never actually considered. It's always been about nose to the grindstone, work, and it will pay off for me in the end. But there's been no steps taken to make sure that it does. So with Mark, about 2 years later, Mark went back to market. And it was honestly a completely different experience. Conversations changed completely. Buyers weren't poking holes anymore. They were actually competing. Instead of explaining weaknesses, he was showing opportunities. Instead of defending the business, he was negotiating from strength. And yes, the final sale price ended up being several $1 million higher than that original offer. And it wasn't because the market changed on Mark, not because we got lucky, but because the business changed. And truly, it was a completely different business from the Mark that walked in the door. And that's really the lesson that I hope sticks with you today. Business value isn't created when you decide to sell. It's created years beforehand. Every process you document, every leader you develop, every unnecessary risk you eliminate, every system you improve, every profitable customer you add, those things don't just make running your company easier. They literally become part of your valuation. So let me leave you with one question. If someone knocked on your door tomorrow with an offer, would you know if it was fair? No, seriously. Would you know? Or would you just be hoping your advisors tell you it's good? Most owners, they don't actually know. They've got a number in their head, but they have no way to back that number up. And that's okay. But it's also something that you can fix. If today's story sounded a little familiar, maybe it's time to get a baseline. At enterprisesage.com, we have a free business valuation questionnaire. It's literally only 18 questions. You can do it online. You can do it at home. You can do it in your bathrobe. You could even do it on the toilet. That's completely up to you. I am not suggesting that that's your route, but nobody's going to force you into a meeting. Nobody's going to pressure you into becoming a client. You simply get a much clearer picture of where your business stands today and where there may be opportunities to increase its value over time. We know that eventually you're going to come looking for answers, and we really hope that you're going to come answers searching to us. But this is the best we can do for you without talking to you. We give you the free business valuation. We show you where your business at. The business valuation actually tells you the areas where your strengths and your weaknesses lie and where you should reinvest capital. We know you're going to come back to us. So this is our gift to you. Knowing where you stand is one of the smartest things you can do. Just wanted to tell you all, thank you for hanging out with me today. I hope this gives you something to think about. And if it did, share this episode with another business owner. Chances are they need to hear it too. And I promise for the next episode, I will not choose the default name Mark unless you really want me to. We'll see you next time on Build Business Better.